We're going to be in Ezra 3, but we're going to run around to a couple of different places. Like I said, I want us to kind of close out our study of the Old Testament for now. So here in a couple of weeks, we'll start something new. And of course, same old question. What is it that you would like to study next? Keep those cards and letters coming in. Chapter 3, in the 7th month, the Israelites had settled in their towns, and the people assembled together as one at Jerusalem. Then Joshua, the son of Jozadak, and his fellow priests, along with Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and his associates, began to build the altar of the God of Israel to sacrifice burnt offerings on it, in accordance with what was written in the law of Moses, the man of God. Despite their fear of the people around them, they built the altar on its foundation, and they sacrificed burnt offerings on it to the Lord, both the morning and the evening sacrifices. Then, in accordance with what is written, they celebrated the festival of the tabernacles with the required number of burnt offerings prescribed for each day. After that, they presented the regular burnt offerings, the new moon sacrifices, sacrifices for all the appointed sacred festivals of the Lord, as well as those brought as freewill offerings to the Lord. On the first day of the 7th month, they began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord, though the foundation of the Lord's temple had not yet been laid. Okay, so they've been back home about 7 months. At the end of 7 months, then they all come together and they're going to reestablish the worship, at least at the site of the old temple. The problem is the old temple is not standing anymore. It's been destroyed, and they haven't even redone the foundation. So in 7 months, what they've done is reestablish themselves. They've gotten settled back in to their places of residence, and they've begun to have some feuding with the people that live in the area, and we'll see a little bit more about that in just a minute. Look back at chapter 2, and we won't go through all the lists. Chapter 2 tells us who moved back and how many, and it's not really useful to us. But look at verse 62. Chapter 2, verse 62. There was a group, and it's listed above it. These searched for their family records, but they could not find them, and so were excluded from the priesthood as unclean. The governor ordered them not to eat any of the most sacred food until there was a priest ministering with the Urim and Thummim. So this is kind of a legal matter. Folks that wanted to go back to work as priests, and they couldn't bring the right paperwork. So they didn't have their birth certificate. They couldn't get their travel visa. They couldn't get everything lined out to do what they wanted to do. And so they're told, if you'll wait, maybe there'll be a priest who is ministering with the Urim and Thummim. Do you remember the Urim and Thummim? Right? They're that way of finding things out that the high priest carried around, and he would somehow ask a question of God, and the Urim and Thummim would help him to find out. So perhaps they're going to allow these folks to be grandfathered in if the Urim and Thummim says so. So we're going to have to ask the high priest, find out whether or not these guys are going to be acceptable to serve. Remember, they're moving back after being away from the temple for a couple of generations. So the reestablishing is not simple. Reestablishing the temple and its sacrificial system is not simple. And they have people living around them that are not too keen on the temple being rebuilt, and or want the temple to be rebuilt, but want to be part of it. They want to have a hand in it. So they want to make political alliances that the Jews are not really willing to make. And again, we'll see something else about that in a minute. But even though 7 months doesn't seem like a really, really long time, what kind of worship was going on prior to this, if any? Were the families worshiping independently? Was anybody doing anything at the temple? Right? Cyrus gave them the right to go back home and gave them a stipend to help rebuild the temple. So it takes 7 months, and this is the first time they've done something. So just kind of hold that in the back of your mind. The altar is in place, sacrifices are renewed, but the foundation has yet to be rebuilt. So So it's kind of an open air type worship. The people are coming to where the temple should be, to where the old temple stood, and they're having worship and sacrifices there. They do have a reestablished priesthood who are serving, at least the ones who were able to prove that they really were who they said they were. Right? Verse 7 of chapter 3. They gave the money to the masons and the carpenters, and they gave food and drink and olive oil to the people of Sidon and Tyre, so that they would bring cedar logs by the sea from Lebanon to Joppa, as authorized by Cyrus, the king of Persia. Who was the last king to buy cedars from Lebanon and have them shipped down to Joppa? David, yeah. So when Solomon was building his temple, David had made arrangements for the king of Lebanon to provide those cedars. And we'll mention again how important this is in just a minute. In the second month of the second year, after their arrival at the house of God in Jerusalem, Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, Joshua, the son of Jozadak, and the rest of the people, the priests and the Levites, and all who had returned from captivity to Jerusalem, began the work. They appointed Levites 20 years old and older to supervise the building of the house of the Lord. Joshua and his sons and brothers, and Kadmiel and his sons, who were descendants of Hodaviah, the sons of Henadad and their sons and brothers, all Levites, joined together in supervising those working on the house of God. When the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests in their vestments and with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals, took their place to praise the Lord as prescribed by David, the king of Israel. With praise and thanksgiving they sang to the Lord, He is good. His love toward Israel endures forever. And all the people gave a great shout of praise to the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But many of the older priests and the Levites and the family heads who had seen the former temple wept aloud when they saw the foundation of this temple being laid, while many others shouted for joy. No one could distinguish the sound of the shouts of joy from the sounds of weeping, because the people made so much noise, and the sound was heard far away. So these people have a very deep desire to reestablish temple worship the way it was before. Now, the younger generation has never experienced it. So to them, it is exciting that it's coming back. Something that Mom and Dad told me about, something that my grandmother used to tell me about while we were away in Babylon. And now that we're home, it's exciting that we're finally going to get the temple back, because it's such an identifier of who we are. When Cyrus sends them back, he doesn't say, okay, I'm going to send you back so you can rebuild the residence of King David, or you could rebuild Solomon's palace. He sends them back with the understanding that they're going to rebuild the temple. It was one of the wonders of the ancient world. It was an amazing edifice, and Cyrus knows that. So he sends them back with the opportunity to rebuild. And the young'uns are excited about that. But the old ones, not so much. But a couple of things that you can tell how dedicated they were. Number one, they wanted to have the cedars from Lebanon again. That's got to be part of it. If you're going to rebuild this temple correctly, you've got to have the right pieces and parts. Becky and I like to watch the shows on TV where they're redoing old houses. And the ones that just go in and renovate them and update them, they're not as interesting to me. But the ones who try to find the pieces and parts that are authentic to that time frame, right? We're redoing a 1920 bungalow, and so we're shopping to find this piece of wood that was definitely in a 1920s bungalow. We're going to bring it back and we're going to put it in. They were interested in making sure that the cedars from Lebanon were part of this, because they were so much a part of Solomon's temple. When they get ready to worship, the worship music that they choose for the first day is the same worship music that they used on the first day when they dedicated Solomon's temple. Right? The Lord is has great love for Israel, his people. Great is God because his love never ends for the people of Israel. And the same lineup of instruments, the same lineup of lyrics, everything was to be exactly the same so that they could rededicate this piece of ground exactly as it had been before. Maybe sometime we should go through a series of lessons on the idea of the Reformation movement in the 15, 16, 1700s and the Restoration movement. The idea that in the Restoration movement they wanted to go past all of the trappings of all of the religion since the first century and try to rebuild based on what we could find out from the New Testament writings. That's what these people wanted. They wanted David's Psalms, they wanted Solomon's temple, and they wanted to reestablish worship the way it was before they were sent off into captivity. So think about the older people, and they're not quietly crying on the back seat. They're wailing because this isn't the temple that they remember. At the same time, you've got young people who are so excited that they've been set free from captivity and they're rebuilding the legacy of their people in this temple, and they're shouting for joy, but they're not being quiet about it either. So you've got people screaming yay and people screaming nay all at the same time. And so Ezra says there was no way to tell them apart because the noise was so loud. Unfortunately, after they get the work started, they have an interference. Look at chapter 4, Ezra chapter 4, beginning in verse 1. When the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the exiles were building a temple for the Lord, the God of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel and to the heads of the families, and they said, "Let us help you build, because like you, we seek your God and have been sacrificing to him since the time of Esarhaddon, the king of Assyria, who brought us here." So we conquered the north and we moved into this area and we've infiltrated and we've become part of the population here. And we know who God is and we want to be part of this. Are they Jews? No. Are they clean people? No. Right? Who's building the temple? The guys who are working on the temple, the guys who are overseeing the work on the temple, are from the tribe of Levi. Right? You've got priestly people who can prove what their ancestry is. And so here comes this group, and they say, well, we're just like you, and we want to help you build the most important building in your religious practice. And Zerubbabel, Joshua, and the rest of the heads of the families of Israel said, "You have no part with us in building a temple to our God. We alone will build it for the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us." So we've got authority from the king of Persia, and he told us that we could rebuild our temple and you've got nothing to do with it. That starts a problem. And it was about 10 years worth of problem. So there's legal battles going on. These guys are filing suits against the Israelites rebuilding their temple because they can't be part of it. And it gets tied up in litigation among the ruling sect, right? So Persia has to know what's going on. Darius, who's the king of the Medes, about 10 years later is finally going to make a decision about how this is going to work out. Okay? So we're happy, happy, joy, joy, or we're crying because it's not the original temple, and then eventually things just kind of grind to a halt. Look over at Haggai. He's the third from the end. Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. Haggai chapter 1. Folks are not too keen on starting problems. And again, there's, restraining orders, if you want to call them that, kind of going around. They're battling things out at a level that most of these folks have no real control over. But look at Haggai chapter 1. Here's God's response. Haggai chapter 1, verse 1. In the second year of King Darius, on the first day of the 6th month, the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest. So same two guys that were there for the inaugural, redoing of the temple platform, the temple thing the temple sits on. What's it called? Foundation. When they're laying the foundation. This is what the Lord Almighty says. These people say the time has not yet come to rebuild the Lord's house. Then the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. Is it time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses while this house remains a ruin? Now this is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. You have planted much, but harvested little. You eat, but you never have enough. You drink, but you never have your fill. You put on clothes, but you're still not warm. You earn wages only to put them in a purse that has holes in it. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. Go up into the mountains and bring down timber and build my house, so that I may take pleasure in it and be honored, says the Lord. You expected much, but see, it turned out to be little. What you brought home, I blew away. Why, declares the Lord Almighty? Because of my house, which remains a ruin, which each of you is busy with your own house. Therefore, because of you, the heavens have withheld their dew, and the earth has withheld its crops. I called for a drought on the fields and the mountains, on the grain, the new wine, the olive oil, and everything else the ground produces, on people and livestock, and on all the labor of your hands. And so during that decade, while the people are all in litigation and they're afraid to proceed because their neighbors are angry with them and they're afraid they might be attacked if they build the temple, they're not sure exactly what they need to do, but they think, well, what we can really do is plant fields and fix up our houses that were broken down when we left and all the things that need to be done. So they had a lot of busy work that they needed to do, all in the name of Israel, while the temple was still just this platform, right? Still just a foundation. They were still making sacrifices, but not building the temple. God finally says, look, if it's time to rebuild yours, it's time to rebuild mine. So following this, the people finally get busy. Zerubbabel puts them back into action, and they actually rebuild the Lord's temple. And that temple stood until 70 A.D. With some embellishments from King Herod in the first century. He enlarged the platform. He made it bigger. He made it shinier, lots of gold. Made it a very beautiful place to go for worship. But then again, in 70 A.D., the Romans tear it completely down to the ground. As Jesus would say, not one stone would be left on another. That kind of closes out the history of the Old Testament. They finally get the temple built. Zechariah and Malachi are telling them you need to turn your hearts to God, not just follow the outlines of worship, not just with your hands, but with your heart. And then the Old Testament comes to a close. We might spend some time studying in Zechariah and Malachi sometime, just as a side, but I think that's as far as I want to go anyway in the study of the Old Testament.